Welcome to Diversity in Practice, Understanding Intersectionality. I'm Emma Nugent, Information Sharing Project Officer from the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare. Before we begin, I'd like to make an acknowledgement of country. We would like to acknowledge that we are all joining you today from Aboriginal land. For me, it is the Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and extend this respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here with us today. We acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. The Diversity in Practice webinar series has been developed by the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare and will explore what good practice looks like when engaging with children and young people from diverse backgrounds and communities. This webinar series is supported by the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing and Family Safety Victoria under the MARAM Sector Capacity Building Project. The MARAM framework highlights that children are victim survivors in their own right, with their own unique experiences of family violence, including specific threats, risks, protective factors, and risk management approaches. MARAM emphasises that all interventions must consider the impacts on each and every victim survivor, including children and young people. This webinar series aims to explore what this means in practice for our work with children and young people from diverse backgrounds and communities. Furthermore, MARAM uses an intersectional lens throughout its tools and practice guidance as a core part of its assessment. It is important that professionals understand how intersecting factors such as identity, systemic oppression, structural inequality, and discrimination can impact upon the way a child or young person interacts with the service system. Today's session will focus on the topic of understanding intersectionality. Understanding and applying intersectionality in practice assists professionals to recognise how victim survivors uniquely experience family violence, the structural barriers faced to receiving a family violence service, and how they may be specifically targeted by a person using violence. MARAM focuses on intersecting factors such as identity, systemic oppression, structural inequality, and discrimination. An intersectional approach can be used to assist professionals to consider how a child or young person's unique and individual identities and experiences can interact and shape their experiences of and responses to trauma and adverse experiences. An intersectional approach allows for professionals to provide responsive and appropriate services and work toward creating and sustaining a service system that is inclusive, safe, responsive, and accountable for all. Our speakers today will present on this topic and then we'll have a chance to have a facilitated discussion. If you do have any questions for our speakers, please use the question and answer box to ask a question. It is important to note that today's discussion will highlight the successes, challenges, and learnings that each speaker has encountered in their work with children and young people from diverse backgrounds. What will be presented to you today is still a work in progress, and while we don't promise to bring you easy answers or solutions, what we will bring you is an open conversation where audience members and presenters alike can reflect on their practice and work together to create better outcomes for children and young people from diverse backgrounds. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Wendy Lobwein is currently the Senior Manager for the AMES Australia Prevention of Violence Against Women program, where she has developed an innovative leadership program geared toward the culturally and linguistically diverse communities that AMES Australia serves. Prior to this, Wendy had a long international career as head of the Victims and Witnesses sections in 2 international war crimes courts, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in the Netherlands and the Khmer Rouge trials in Cambodia. Before commencing her international work, Wendy was a founding member of the Victorian Foundation for Survivors of Torture, Foundation House, and a counsellor advocate in Victorian Centres Against Sexual Assault, CASA House. Maria Tsopanis is the Senior Manager of Community Development and Social Participation with AMES Australia. Maria leads the implementation of the Community Engagement Strategy and Capacity Building projects with culturally and linguistically diverse communities. These programs create opportunities for new arrivals to participate in community life, form strong social bonds with their cultural groups, and build bridges into the broader community. Maria brings to the role many years of experience working in a variety of employment, education, and community programs at the federal, state, and local levels. Gulsoom Jaghuri is a project coordinator with a decade of experience working on different projects at AMES Australia. Her most recent project, Opening Minds, Building Futures, was geared towards promoting career aspirations and developing pathways to achieve career goals for young people of the Pacifica and South Sudanese communities of Melbourne. I'll pass to our speakers for today's presentation in just a moment, but first, just a few notes on housekeeping. Audience members' microphones and cameras will remain off by default for the duration of today's session. Just a reminder that today's session is being recorded, and there is a content warning for a discussion today. So please ensure you reach out for professional support if this raises any issues for you, or please do feel free to leave today's session if anything does come up for you too. I'd now like to pass to Wendy, Maria, and Gulsoom for today's presentation, and I'm looking forward to hearing it myself. Thank you.
Hello. Can Emma, am I coming through loud and clear?
Yep, sounds perfect.
Hey, I have never actually been in one of these webinars where you don't see any of the participants. So I can see there's about 70 odd of you here, and it's rather like God. One can't see you, but one must believe that you are there. So welcome and good morning. I too want to acknowledge the fact that I am on Indigenous land. Now, of course, after practicing, there we go, here are my slideshows. Acknowledgement, I'm also on the land of the Kulin Nation here in Brunswick near the Merry Creek, and Merry was a word in Woiwurrung for rocky place, and it is a rocky place. It's where the bluestones were mined for many of the city's buildings and roadsides. So I'm representing, along with my two colleagues, AMES Australia. And for those who don't know us, we're a 70-year-old organisation that has worked with new arrivals, refugees and migrants for in specific areas, traditionally and for a long time with English language courses, but now also with employment, with settlement. And for myself, a very particular program around the prevention of violence to ensure that our linguistically and culturally diverse communities are gaining access to the best possible information that we have around the primary prevention of violence. But today I'm here to speak about intersectionality. And I hope I'm not going to be tedious or pedantic by making you start where it all started. But I think it's a term that has been confusing for many people, and I think it's helpful if you know where it came from. So in fact, how it came about, I'm just going ahead there, was in 1989, which is 39 years ago now, a Black American scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw, a legal academic, she coined that term, intersectionality, as a way of helping explain the particular oppression of African American women. So it was really developed as a kind of legal term because it was based on a legal case where a Black woman had applied for work at a car manufacturing plant but was rejected. Now, she claimed discrimination, that she wasn't hired because of discrimination, that she was a Black woman. And it went to a court decision, and the court upheld the car plant's refusal to hire her, claiming they did not discriminate against her because they hire Black people and they hire women. And the car plant did hire Black people, but for mechanical and technical positions, and they only hired Black men. And they do hire women, but they only hire women for clerical positions, and they only hired white women. So this term was coined to show the intersection of being Black and female is what led to her discrimination. Now, this term wasn't universally embraced to begin with, so that's why I brought you this little cartoon here. And it was a point of contention in feminist circles, and it led eventually to the development of Black and third world feminism. So you can see the cartoon, we've got a man there saying, why can't you just be equalist or humanist, we're all equal. And the woman there says, because the disenfranchisement of women needs to be addressed specifically. And then, of course, in the next cartoon, she's going, why do you need Black feminism? It should be just feminism. Why would you divide us? So it did cause a bit of contention, but it quickly caught on. So it was an academic term to help analyze discrimination But as happens with new jargon or buzzwords, it quickly got adopted and developed meaning outside the original targets. So you can read there that it made it into the Oxford English Dictionary in 2015, where it became a sociological term. You can see there the interconnected nature of social categorizations. And then it turned up in the Merriam-Webster's definition, a little less academic, and also really focused again on multiple forms of discrimination. Just giving you a moment to have a look at those. Crenshaw herself, who'd coined the term, realized that it had come far from its original meanings over the years. And so she herself now says that intersectionality is a lens, which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks, and that, oh, sorry, I don't know what's going on there, that it's not simply that there's a race problem here and there's a gender problem there and there's a socioeconomic class problem here or an LGBTQ problem there. She's saying that those frameworks erases what happens to people who are subject to all of those things. So she's acknowledging that it is also changed in meaning. And a few years ago, someone quoted in New York Magazine that even as the word intersectionality becomes more common, its meaning becomes less clear. And if you think the term is coming less clear, let me show you some of the diagrams. So if you do a quick Google in images, you can see that there are a number of diagrams that try to capture intersectionality. And some of them, like this one, are terribly well, I find it difficult to read and easily understand, but I did pick one that I quite like, and I think it had its origins in Canada. And this is the one that I find reflects better the situation in Australia, where we have your central is the unique circumstances of an individual. But the very outside, the broadest circle there includes the things like the aspects like colonization and our historical forces and our education system and capitalism, war, globalizing, politics. All of those are involved. And in fact, even the term intersectionality has got caught up in a kind of political argument where people are either for it or against it without actually knowing what it is, but it's become shorthand like alt-right or liberal. So it's important to know the definitions, and the definition is changing, and I think we'll see it continue to develop. But as Crenshaw did say herself, she says intersectionality can now sometimes be used as a blanket term to mean it's complicated. And she says sometimes it's complicated is a excuse to do nothing. So that's not the intention of the term. The intention is to use the best parts of it. So let's have a look at the Australian context. Now, here in Australia, the concept's been taken up in many different sectors. Also the case in Canada and countries like ours with a very multicultural society. In Australia, we've used this term intersectionality and the concept as a powerful tool for promoting and working towards social justice, equity, and social inclusion. So we've moved it away from being just an academic tool to analyze human experience and how the multiple and overlapping experiences of oppression interact on individuals and communities and society. Taken it from that and now using it to inform us how then do we need to adapt and change our systems, our services, our policies so that they better suit or more appropriate for or reduce barriers for members of our diverse community. So we've made it here in Australia a very active tool and use it as a way to direct our services. Now, when I say that we use it to reduce barriers for our diverse community, I do really mean diverse in the context of all of us. We're a multicultural country. I am part of the diversity of Australia, but I have come from an Anglo-Celtic background, and I'm a member of the dominant culture of Australia. So Australia has a very dominant culture, even though it's a hugely multicultural and diverse society. Now, what that means, what a dominant culture means, is that one particular practices with one particular focus sets what is normal for the entire society. So the dominant culture of a society establishes its mainstream social customs, its languages, its values, its religions. The dominant culture in Australia includes speaking English, largely Christian, though that is changing, largely sharing a European ancestry, that's rapidly changing, and particularly an Anglo-Celtic ancestry. Now, I've brought this into the discussion of intersectionality because membership or not membership of the dominant culture changes the experience of being an Australian. And I met a young man from who'd migrated to Australia from Nigeria. I met him in Adelaide, actually. And he said to me, I was in a supermarket and this white man ran up to me and he just said, I just want to tell you, you're welcome. You're welcome here in Australia. And I was kind of envisaging that man's feeling of goodwill and wanting to be welcoming. And this young man said to me, but I've been here 8 years. He said, when am I also Australian? When am I just part of the society? And I thought, well, you could have said to him, and you're welcome too. When did your family arrive? Because the truth is we are all of those of us who are not Indigenous, are migrants or refugees to this country. But our culture is so strong, the dominant Anglo-Celtic culture has become normalized. And those who are not members have a very different experience. Another example is, I'm rather known in circles as a tram nanny, because it really annoys me when people get in the tram and jam up all the entrance and exits when there's room in the spaces. So when I get on a tram, I'm middle-aged, larger Australian Anglo nasal voice woman, I'm there, oi, you, move up. Yes, you, move. And people move because I am acceptable in this society. But if I was the same woman in a hijab, or a Sikh man in a turban, or a really tall Sudanese young person, I wouldn't get the response that I got. It would be received very differently, according to who and how I'm perceived. So it is this intersection of not just intersectionality, but intersectionality in the kind of society and dominant culture that we have. And I just wanted to say a couple of things. It's I'm not sure if I'll take us there, but anyway, I just want to say that one of the things about being a member of the dominant culture is that we have a lot of unexamined biases. So AMES, for example, does a lot of cross-cultural competency training. Obviously, most of our training is for the dominant Anglo organisations around how to work effectively in and with a multicultural workforce and society. But in fact, you know, we've often found that those who've migrated or arrive as refugees have better cross-cultural skills because they are working cross-culturally all the time. So for me, it's easy to get on the tram and yell at everybody. For somebody else who doesn't look a member of dominant culture or is newly arrived, will have that very different experience. And so constantly they're working cross-culturally because of our dominant culture. So it is a bit of a sideline, but I wanted to look at this unconscious bias because it's really important as a practice of intersectionality to be constantly examining these biases that we have, even though those of us with very egalitarian views have hidden biases. And I've just put the words there like mental residue. It's very difficult to become aware of your own biases. It's much easier to spot them in other people. So, for example, I don't know who amongst you are my age and my generation, but in crayon colors, we used to have a crayon called Skin Color, and it was a kind of pinkish, orangish color. I think they've called it peach now, but that is the impact of a dominant culture. I remember my mother buying stockings, and she used to choose the variety called flesh colored, but of course they're not fresh colored, they're Barbara Lobwein colored. And so I know that we've moved past those very blatant biases, which are actually racism, but nevertheless, there are still these deeply embedded unconscious acceptance of normality that we need to challenge. And I wanted to talk to you, for example, like about car accidents. I mean, did you know that women are 47% more likely to be seriously injured in a car accident than a man, and that a woman is 3 times more vulnerable to whiplash and 17% more likely to die as a result of a car crash? Now, why? Because cars are designed using the male body as the crash test dummy. So this is about deep entrenched understanding of what's normal. So it's not like the car company sat down and said, let's make sure men are protected and who cares about women. But the deeply accepted view that the male is the normal, or that the standard, means that women, the bias against women becomes sexism, and that women have a much poorer outcome. Now, I can imagine you thinking I've taken you away from intersectionality, but what I'm trying to do is locate intersectionality here in this society, with this culture, with this country, which includes, of course, colonization. So intersectionality means we have to have this ongoing critical reflection, examining dominant approaches, cultures, and ideas, so that we can be sure how do these exclude or marginalize or oppress people and communities, because we do not want to inadvertently replicate or perpetuate these. We need those to change. Now, at a policy level, intersectionality is becoming a very recognized term and, in fact, a key principle. So, for example, for those of us in, I guess, in the health and welfare sectors, just in my own field, which is around family violence and prevention of family violence, the Victorian government has included as a key concept, intersectionality was a feature of the implementation of the Royal Commission into Family Violence, and the Victorian government developed a 10-year plan, Everybody Matters, inclusion and equity statement, where ensuring intersectionality practices were prioritized, integrated, and embedded. The Victoria's Free from Violence policy, which is the approach to family violence primary prevention, it applies to intersectionality as a principle across all programming. That includes workforce capacity building and prevention activities. Federally, the national plan, you may have heard of the National Plan to End Violence Against Women. We're in a new 10-year cycle. This includes intersectionality as a cross-cutting principle across all its programs. And federally and state funded, a joint initiative by, of all states, fund an organisation called Our Watch. And Our Watch have established that intersectionality has to be key. It's strongly endorsed in their national framework for all of us working in prevention of violence, is intersectionality. So you can see that it's becoming a real priority. And in fact, it'll become increasingly required of us to demonstrate that our understanding of intersectionality and our understanding and implementation of intersectional practices in our performances and in our funding applications. So if I take us to intersectionality in practice, I just wanted to give you a quick look at this, which is a way of building a service at a practice level. Now, all the figures there are women. Oh, I do think I have one male identifies as a woman, that coming from the sector of multicultural services for women. And one of the ways is to consult, to partner with, to engage all different kinds of people with different kinds of issues, to picture them coming through the door of your service and determining what adaptations you would need to make that would make your service equitable and appropriate for them. Now, I want to caution against imagining their experience. Imagination won't show the needs in the way that consulting, partnering, and engaging will bring you. So there are practice tools out there to help you work through what it's like for different people to walk through your door so that you can ensure, regardless who they are, and what their life steps have been like, they receive an equitable and fair service. Now, there's one last thing, and then it's time for me to finish, but we have intersectionality is being used and has been used and stemmed from an analysis of overlapping oppressions. And but I found these next couple of slides in a United Nations Human High Commission for Refugee document. And it just gives a little bit of insight into a further development in the way that we can think about intersectionality. Now, I don't love these slides, but stay with me. I think they give the point. So we have here a woman in a refugee camp. And if we look at the oppressions that she's dealing with, she's Black, she's poor, she's frightened, she's been raped, she's disabled, she's stateless, she's dependent on charity, she's a single mother, she's vulnerable, she's marginalized. And what happens when we identify those oppressions as part of her life is she kind of just disappears as an individual and she becomes a refugee woman, almost a stereotype, a caricature. But then, of course, we meet this woman and she's a proud Muslim. She's a head of a family. She's a teacher. She's a good mother. She supports her parents and her siblings. She's a daughter. She's resistant. And of course, she's the same woman. So in fact, to accurately understand the intersectionality of a person in their place in society, we should be looking at all the layers of her identity. If we're not looking at all the layers of her identity, both the oppressions and her strengths, if we don't recognize her strengths, then we really risk patronizing, stereotyping, and really increasing powerlessness. But if we don't recognize the oppressions and the challenges, then we risk overlooking that intersectional discrimination that she faces and the way that she's marginalized and denied opportunity. So an intersectional analysis can allow us to see all of her. So just in case you're wondering where I've taken you over the last 20 minutes, I have covered where the term intersectionality came from and what it's become. I've talked about how adopting an intersectional, I can't say that word anymore, how an intersectional practice is impacted by our being a diverse society, but with a dominant culture. And finally, had a very quick look at what intersectionality means in the environment of family violence from a policy and a practice perspective. And of course, concluding now with the recommendation or the idea of the totality of the individual, as well as those labels of oppression and of strength. Now, as I hand over, just like we don't want this woman in the refugee camp disappearing into the single identity of a refugee woman, we also don't want the cultural and linguistic uniqueness of our non-Anglo youth to disappear into the single identity of a migrant or refugee young person. So I'm handing over now to Gul and Maria, my colleagues at AMES, who are going to talk about this great project they just completed with youth from 2 different cultural and linguistic communities. Gul, do you want, can you take over the slides or will I stay with them?
Can you please stay with them and
Yes.
yeah, just go next for us. Thank you. Thank you so much, Wendy. That was a really great presentation. So as Emma mentioned in the beginning, and Wendy as well, that my name is Gulsoom Jaghuri, and I am the project coordinator at AMES Australia. So today I'm here to talk about a youth initiative, which was called Opening Minds, Building Futures. So the project was a free career education project designed to help engage, inform, and empower young people from Pacifica South Sudanese backgrounds in identifying their career goals and pathways to build confidence in their parents, school influencers who were involved in their career journeys. The project was delivered through a collaborative partnership between AMES Australia and Centre for Multicultural Youth. So the multicultural youth workers from CMY and the career counsellors from AMES Australia provided support to these young people from these two communities in pursuing whichever career suits them, not just what has traditionally been considered accessible to these people. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of the background of this project and why we had to deliver such a project was because the research, shows that both South Sudanese and the Pacifica young people are disadvantaged, in accessing career guardians in two regions of metropolitan Melbourne, which is the southeast and the west of Melbourne, and they're also overrepresented in unemployment data compared with the other Victorian young people. So basically, the 17% of the Pacifica young people in Melbourne are early school leavers, compared with the 9.8% of young people across the general population. Pacifica youth unemployment rates are also almost double the state average. And on the employment front, there is a higher than average Pacifica participation in a blue-collar jobs and 50% less than the average representation in professions like a technical and scientific industries. Next slide, thank you. And 31.8% of the South Sudanese young people in Melbourne are unemployed, compared with the Victorian population at 6.6%. So these are the lack of information about employment pathways that they have access to, and professional networks, local job market knowledge, and skills and experience that are required for different jobs. Next slide, thank you. So the project model was designed, to be agile and flexible. So it was involved combined expertise of youth workers from the centre, from the CMY and the career counsellors from AMES Australia, in supporting these young people in terms of the pathways options, through strength-based, co-designed and cultural sensitive approach, including connections with mentors and role models. So this organizational and individual lived experience allowed for a more impactful, achievable and engaging response for these young people disadvantaged in the career pathways options. So this project was also extended knowledge of individual needs to build aspirations for communities and those providing career guardians. So now I would like to hand over to Maria to talk about some of the learnings from this project. So over to you, Maria. Thank you.
Thank you, Gul. And thanks, Wendy, for your presentation. And as Emma introduced me, my name is Maria Tsopanis, Senior Manager for Community Development and Social Participation. And the Opening Minds Building Futures program was funded through the Career Institute, through the Department of Science and Industry. And I suppose really there were quite a few unexpected learnings that we identified that really impacted young people's aspirations and pathways into different career roles. One of the main ones in terms of the Pacifica young people was a structural issue actually around their citizenship status. So for much of the community in the time in Australia, citizenship had not been accessed. They had no right to citizenship status. And in recent times, there had been changes to federal government policy, which meant that young people who were born in Australia after 1986 and had spent 10 years in Australia could claim eligibility to citizenship status, which of course opened up a myriad of opportunities, services, but also importantly, tertiary qualification, access to tertiary qualification. So previously, young people weren't accessing tertiary qualifications because if they did, they would have to access it at a high international fee paying rate, which obviously many of the families could not afford. So what this really did was reinforce within the community that access to tertiary education was out of their reach. This was then reinforced within the community, the broader mainstream community, particularly within schools, career counsellors. So, of course, opportunities that could have been available to many of the young people weren't, because they were viewed that, no, they were going to leave school and get jobs. And for many of the young people, they really did feel this financial pressure and burden on them. They wanted to contribute to the well-being of the family. And I suppose this really talks to, this structural issue, back to some of those statistics that Gul gave around the Pacifica community being overrepresented in blue-collar work as well, and underrepresented in professional roles, because the pathway access was denied. So what that then did was reinforce all these, I suppose, biases that we had of what these young people could actually achieve. So in part, one of our roles was to actually promote and foster the fact that these young people may have been able to claim citizenship status, which would change the range of opportunities open to them dramatically. So that was really, really critical. It was a structural issue. It still remains an issue for the community as they work through, obviously, applying for citizenship status, re-educating the community in terms of what is accessible for them, and also the school communities and the broader mainstream community. So stereotype views of student achievement also, and their aspirations. So in part, some of the student aspiration was linked back to this lack of citizenship status. But of course, what that does is reinforce these views of a pathway that is limited. So for many of the young people, they also had limited aspirations because they thought they weren't able to access it. So you can see how that would perpetuate a whole situation where people were stuck in a way. The other really important thing that we learned, which was part of this intersectionality, about gaining acceptance from community elders and parents as to what we were doing and the opportunities that could be available. So in part, our role was also to broaden the career knowledge of the parents and community leaders, to really encourage and raise the knowledge for their children's pathways. Next slide, thanks, Wendy. And in terms of the South Sudanese young people, quite different again. Obviously, the community as a whole had impacts of pre-migration refugee experience. So, situations of protracted time in refugee camps, perhaps disrupted education, and experiences of torture and trauma. Then they come into Australia, and for many of the adult population, they saw access to education as a pathway to opportunity, which unfortunately it didn't happen. So we were quite surprised that the number of parents that we came across who had degrees and postgraduate degrees and yet we're still struggling to find employment. Now, this could be for a number of factors. Lack of Australian work experience is always touted, but to me, that's subtext for racism and discrimination. It could be that their experience wasn't commensurate to the actual qualification they held. And in some instances, they were actually applying for work that, given their qualifications, was under what would be viewed as underskilled for them, basically. So the high levels of unemployment and related poverty reinforce a lack of aspiration for young people. They were looking at their parents saying, well, you've got all these qualifications and you can't get a job. So why am I going to go and pursue, you know, a degree and whatever, if in fact I'm not going to be able to get a job anyway? So these kind of negative outcomes were being reinforced and perpetuated. And they are a combination, as Wendy spoke about it, of a number of intersectional factors, you know, race, gender, educational status, socioeconomic class, pre-arrival experience, a whole range of different factors. On top of that, we experienced during the course of our program significant youth violence within the community, but, you know, which is always perpetuated in the media as a race thing. But actually, what was, you know, when in discussions with Victoria Police and a range of other providers, young people were being targeted by criminal syndicates because they saw them as vulnerable and an opportunity to misguide. So these were all these factors that were impacting on the community. However, what we did see was that the use of role models, positive role models within our program, whenever we presented someone from a young person from South Sudanese Australian community who had achieved and who spoke about their journey and how they overcome the various challenges, that was so powerful. And you could see, you know, the sort of penny dropping within the young people's minds that, oh, actually, there is hope. We do have opportunity, and it may be challenging, but we do have an opportunity. So, and I'll leave it there. I think right on time. You're on mute, Wendy.
Sorry, I'd unmute myself. Great. Well, I'm going to stop sharing. Emma, does that time to stop sharing?
Yeah, all good. We might jump into some questions.
Okay.
But first, I wanted to thank you all for your presentation and your valuable insights. I think what you presented today is so useful for practitioners in supporting their practice with young people and families more broadly. So I'm sure everyone watching here today will have taken something away from each of your presentations. I think it's really great. So we'll move on to some questions. Just a reminder that we do have time for a short audience question and answer session. So if you do have any questions for our speakers today, please feel free to enter them into the question and answer box. I do see one just about getting presentation slides. Wendy, is that okay to send out presentation slides after the?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, beautiful.
Maybe just let me check that I've probably identified the source.
Of
I
course.
think I have, but I better double check because I did pinch some stuff.
Amazing. Yeah, we'll be sure to get out a little information pack to everyone here today after the webinar. But we'll get started with our first question, and I think I'll direct that towards School and Maria, just based on the work you've done for the Opening Minds Building Futures project. And the first question is, how can different perceptions of race, class, gender, etc., create systems of oppression and put children and young people at risk?
Thanks, Emma. Well, I think what we've seen was that all those factors tend to put young people, we tend to view people within a stereotype or with our conscious and unconscious bias. And so we tend to put the young people in a box rather than really looking at the young person as an individual and perhaps looking at their strengths rather than their deficits, as I suppose Wendy's picture of the woman in a refugee camp. You know, we all have strengths and we all have weaknesses. And, you know, what happens when we come with race and class and gender, we put people in boxes, and then it's hard to move outside of that. And what often happens is that person internalizes, the young person tends to internalize all of that negativity. And what it does is reinforce those negative outcomes. So it becomes almost a perpetuating cycle. So to break that, we really need, as practitioners, to take the person as an individual and work from a strength-based approach and not look at the deficits. Anybody else want to make a comment?
Oh, good. I think that was a fantastic answer, Maria. Thank you. Might move on to our next one. This is an open question for anyone who wants to answer, but what do you think the key enablers are that underpin an intersectional approach?
Sorry, the key, Emma, I missed that second word.
Key enablers.
Key enablers. Look, I think understanding the term, that's why I laboured a bit where it came from and how it changed, because there is a lot of confusion about what it means, and I've also seen some kind of mockery about what it means. And those of us who are old enough and come out of the community development field, we kind of see it as familiar, because it was one of the primary tenets of community development, was understanding, locating the individual within the family, within the community, within the society. And so what I think the challenge is being active in taking that, using it as its analysis tool to adapt services. So I think many people understand that it's your individual footprints and your many intersecting layers that create who you are and what suits you best. But the commitment and the patience and the energy to adapt services, particularly, you know, social services, to meet that is the most challenging part. And because it means being an advocate as well as a service deliverer, it means being aware of the limitations as well as facing the needs. So there are these constant pulls about how best to serve people, and increasingly the need to get it done quickly. I mean, it boils down to some very small things, like in AMES, we see a lot of women who are not digitally literate. And increasingly, as digital literacy becomes an essential skill, to access basic things like making a medical appointment, or, you know, for women getting a breast exam is best done digitally now. And if without that literacy, they're really getting left behind. So it's those tiny factors that that create or a service that works or doesn't work.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Wendy. Did anyone have any other thoughts on that question?
No.
Oh, good. We might zoom in a little bit more. We've been zooming in with these questions, each one we ask. But what I'm interested in is, what are the differences between what an intersectional way of working looks like at an organisational level versus a practice level?
Sorry, can I jump in there as well? So I'm taking over a bit here, but really it is about inclusion. And this is another area that's got to be approached with such rigorousness, because I did find lots of cartoons, but decided not to show them today, about, you know, ticking the diversity box. So there is a hilarious cartoon about an employment situation, a recruitment panel, who found a person who is both disabled, non-Anglo, multilingual, member of the LGBTQI plus community, and they said, oh great, it ticks all the boxes. That's not engagement. That's not reflective practice. And it is about bringing members of diverse communities into positions of influence and responsibility. And I notice from the field often that women who are working in the multicultural sector in family violence are often called upon to advise mainstream services or advise universities or advise projects on specific information around ethnicity and multiculturalism. But I don't frequently ever see them being paid for it or having half the funding put their way, or, you know, ways of really valuing or really including it. So as long as for our culturally linguistically diverse communities are seen as a consulting point or, you know, just an advice point and not brought in and included, I can't see how our organisations will be able to best use their diversity to change in a way that's really responsive.
Thank you for your answer. Maria, I've noticed you've
I was just going to say, and just to add to, I totally agree with what Wendy has said, but obviously, you know, being able to co-design, truly co-design services with our constituent base or people we want to service is important, but it needs to be true consultation, true co-design, and then also input into decision making, because often what's left out is that next step of, yes, we've consulted, we've co-designed, but then they aren't involved in other aspects of implementation, which is around the decision making aspects of the services. And I think that's really, really important.
Thanks, Maria. Well, just conscious of time, I'll get to one last question, and this sort of lends nicely to the answers that we just heard then. I'd love to hear from each of you if possible. But if you are all to give one tip to an organisation or a practitioner to improve the intersectional approach, what would it be? Can be as big or as little as you want it to be.
I'll just reflect back to on one of the cartoons that Wendy actually shared with us today, about that refugee woman in the refugee camp. I think it's always we have to actually look at, at people individually, based on their strengths and also on their weaknesses, because most of the time, I think for us nowadays, it's much easier to visually just looking at people, try to make sure that we understand things about the situations, what they're going through. But I think it's extremely important, to really have a good understanding of the strengths and also the weaknesses of that individual that you're providing. It doesn't matter what kind of service, that you're providing to this particular, individual. So I think that's really important. That's just, a comment from me.
I might go second then, because it's links to Gul. I really do agree. And often in its simplest, its basic respect is that a basic understanding that we're all complex, and that some of our weaknesses aren't our weaknesses. They're the weakness of our structures that make us weak. And I met a fabulous woman at an event one time, and she had significant disabilities, and she said, they don't make me vulnerable. They don't make me vulnerable. Arrogant men make me vulnerable. And so she was reframing where the vulnerability, where the problem was. So that is about one of my tips about where the problem is where the action needs to be directed. And in primary prevention, of course, it really echoes that primary prevention of violence against women. The answer isn't in more shelters or better services. It's in changing the values and social structures of our society to build respect for women and children on those more vulnerable in. And I think alongside that, because I have to have two tips in one, is that capacity to critically reflect, to understand your own biases is so important. And probably at its clearest, I saw a young woman once struggle with the notion of rape in marriage. She just couldn't understand how it was possible, but she was thinking, but they've already had sex, so how could it be rape? And I watched her mind just unfold it until she realized the intrusion, the physical, emotional intrusion, and her eyes light up as she understood what rape in marriage was. We all need to take those enlightenment steps, because once we see the unseen, then we truly are changed by it and we can change it. That's my 2 tips in 1.
Well, you stole one of mine.
Oh, just sorry.
Which was about self-reflection and really making, being aware of our own biases, conscious, and try and tap into the unconscious bias that you have. It always takes me back to, seeing, for myself, I remember many years ago seeing a group of young men walking down the street, and they all had black trackies and black hoods on, and I felt intimidated. But as they walked past me, I realized, oh my goodness, they were just a group of young kids having fun. So we need to check in with ourselves constantly and make no assumptions. Always speak, talk, consult, get the information correct. And I think I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you all for your reflections today, and I hope our audience can take something from today's conversation and presentation away with them into their practice. I think we'll wrap up now. It's bang on 12 p.m. So thank you for joining us for our final webinar of the Diversity in Practice series. Before we wrap up, I'd like to highlight that a complimentary tip sheet has been developed to support the content of this webinar. This tip sheet aims to assist in the building of capacity of workforces to apply an intersectional lens when working with children and young people from diverse backgrounds, and in the assessment and management of family violence and child wellbeing issues. All registered attendees will be sent a copy of the tip sheet with an information pack, along with any other relevant resources mentioned today. And the survey will also appear at the end of the session. So please complete the short survey to let us know your thoughts on today's webinar. Thank you again for attending today's webinar, and I hope you have a good afternoon.
Thank you all, you invisible people.
Yes,
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.